read our mission statement. It'll take a minute or two, but that'll give everybody a chance to get settled in, do whatever they need to do. So let me go ahead and get started with that. Let me put myself, make sure. Okay, I can see people. Okay, well, my name is Gene Rule, and I want to welcome everybody to the Sunday morning at the virtual Marxist Library. And as you know, this is a project of the Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Niebel Proctor Marxist Library. And we were formed about 15 years ago to further the library's goals of preserving our written heritage, as well as supporting emerging struggles for racial and gender equality and for social. The members of ICSS are active in different aspects of people's struggles in the Bay Area and globally. Some are affiliated with specific political parties and tendencies, others are not. We respect one another, but we do not necessarily agree on all issues. Accordingly, the opinions expressed in our lectures, workshops, and publications are those of the authors only and do not represent a group consensus on the issues discussed. We are united, however, in our respect for the work of Karl Marx and our belief that his work will remain as important for the class struggles of the future as they have been for the past. As a group, we continue to draw inspiration from the work of Karl Marx, including his 11th thesis on Feuerbach. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. And remind you that this program is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on our YouTube channel, which is ICSS Marxist. And a link will also be posted on our website, icssmarx.org, and click on completed programs. It's usually posted on the same day. So, and I really want to thank our volunteer technical staff, Raj and Mehmet, who really do a great job of handling the technical aspects of the program.
It's all Mehmet.
And with that, I'll turn it over to Raj to introduce people.
Okay, Sharat Lin is our presenter today. I've known Sharat, as many of you know, since about 1974, when he was doing his PhD at University of California, Berkeley. He's been an activist all his life, and he's traveled all over the world. I'm amazed. I still keep learning places that he has been to that I hadn't heard before. And not only has he been there, he's meticulously records a very disciplined way, both photographically and by his notes. So his reports are very, very much reflecting the reality that he observes. And of course, he's a commentator and a Marxist. So, plus he's a writer. He's well known for, in many journals, he's been writing. So it is indeed my privilege to present to you Sharat Lin once again. Sharat, your microphone, I'm going to unmute it.
There you go.
Okay.
Okay. So, well, thank you very much, Raj and Jean and Mehmet and others at ICSS for organizing this and for having me again. It's always a pleasure and an honor. So today I'm going to talk about U.S. sanctions. You know, of course, the issue is about sanctions in general, but the focus always comes to U.S. sanctions because U.S. sanctions are more onerous, more extensive than any other than the sanctions that are imposed by any other power on the planet. And the question is, first of all, is to understand why that is. Why is it that sanctions applied by a single country are so powerful and so damaging? And secondly, to understand why is it that sanctions have become a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy, you know, in dealing with what the U.S. government perceives as its adversaries. And of course, those adversaries are, you know, when we look at it as people, as human beings, we have a very, I think most people have a very different picture, if they have a picture of what it means to, you know, which countries or which people in the world are truly adversaries, which ones are real threats. The U.S. government has its own perception that is rooted in its framework, its framing of national security, which has become very all-encompassing, comes out of the Cold War, and has evolved in recent years to encompass other players who are not necessarily threats to the U.S., but rather they do not follow the U.S.'s political line. They don't fall into line. They don't sort of behave according to the U.S. government's thinking or its norms. So that's why I want to get into this. And so now I'm going to put up let me see if I can put up my PowerPoint here.
It's coming up, Sharat.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go. Yes, we can see it now.
Okay, good. So this is the talk for today: U.S. sanctions, the weaponization of the global financial system. And so as I'm suggesting here, the U.S. sanctions are not just an instrument of foreign policy, but what rather they are a means of waging war. It's literally a means of waging war through the financial system, through financial controls, through all the elements that, as you can see, as you'll see in this talk, that sanctions involve. Okay, so the first question is, why sanctions? Why does the United States and a few other players use sanctions? And I will say that, you know, the sanctions, you can take of all the sanctions, the major sanctions that have been exercised in recent decades, they really come from three entities, and there really are two drivers. So the first driver is the United States. The second one is the European Union, and the European Union does this, at least in part, in response to the U.S., because it's, you know, most of the powerful countries of the European Union are U.S. allies, and so they tend to follow U.S. sanctions, although not always. In fact, there are many very significant exceptions, and the most recent of which, of course, is Iran and Cuba, where Cuba, the Europeans have a very different outlook on these countries. And then the third entity, which I say is really driven by the U.S., is the United Nations Security Council. And so these three entities, U.S., the European Union, the United Nations, but the United States is really the driver behind all of them, in a sense. So one of the reasons for sanctions, of course, is punishment for countries that have socialist revolutions and expropriate private property. So two of the earliest countries that did this, of course, are North Korea and Cuba. And it's not that other countries hadn't done this. You know, Russia, China had done it earlier, but these were countries that had their socialist revolutions at a time when the United States was just beginning to exercise its financial muscle as a weapon to try to punish or control these countries. And so Cuba was one of the first that came under a formal sanctions policy after its revolution in 1959. By 1960, in phases, the embargo, the U.S. embargo or blockade of Cuba was implemented in a series of steps between 1961 and 62, 63. Another reason that the U.S. uses for sanctions is when a country just, adopts socialism. So the United States has always had this anti-communist, this is the Cold War legacy, but it's also because socialism is a genuine alternative to capitalism. It threatens the notion that the capitalist system is the only system. And so sanctions have been used against Cuba, against the blockade against North Korea, have been used to sort of punish these countries for socialism, their defiance of capitalism. A third reason is the failure to accept international capitalist rules. So there are countries that may limit foreign investment. They may, fine transnational corporations, and the U.S. may levy various levels of sanctions or punitive measures against those countries for taking these kinds of actions. Weapons of mass destruction, of course, is something that has received a lot of attention specifically with regard to Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. And of course, we have to be reminded that if we talk about weapons of, let's put this in perspective. Weapons of mass destruction, when we talk about nuclear weapons, remember that there's the P5, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council that are sort of grandfathered as nuclear powers because they existed before the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, was signed. And so they are grandfathered as nuclear powers, and any country that comes along afterwards is subject to sanctions or punishment if it develops nuclear weapons. Well, the first 2 countries that, I shouldn't say the first 2, but the sixth one was India, and India being a big country, being one that the United States wanted to be on its side, although back in 1974, India was pursuing a policy which was trying to balance its relations between the Soviet Union and the US. Nevertheless, the US didn't want to totally alienate India partly because of its size, and so it slapped sanctions on India for its first nuclear test in 1974, and then 2 years later, it basically scrapped them. And Pakistan in 1998, I guess that it was Pakistan in the rivalry with India. The United States, as of that point in time, was still more or less siding with Pakistan. So it slapped sanctions and then relaxed them. Of course, the one that we never hear about is Israel, which is a nuclear power. And interestingly enough, Israel is the only country that never has had to test its nuclear weapons. And the reason for that is because it has all the test results from the United States. And it's the only country that can send its nationals to get a US security clearance to have all the information about the US's nuclear bomb designs. And then any country after that is sanctioned for developing nuclear weapons, for not conforming to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, ostensibly. In the case of Iran and North Korea, it's also because, it's particularly so because these countries are among the countries that have not conformed to U.S. foreign policy, and so the U.S. government views that these countries need to be punished. They are targets of regime change. The allegations of human rights violations are, we have to understand what it means when what the United States uses human rights for. I mean, every year the State Department produces a thick report on the human rights report to the president, and it details the human rights situations as the State Department sees them in every country of the world except the U.S. And I wouldn't say that the compilation of data is inaccurate. I think the State Department has professionals who try to do their job, but the point is that this human rights report is used very, very selectively as a matter of foreign policy to put pressure on countries that do not conform, that do not fall into line. And so when Saudi Arabia violates human rights, and it's documented in the human rights report to the president, but it isn't those human rights violations are never acted upon because it's the option of the president to decide whether to sanction a country for human rights violations. But if Iran or North Korea do that, then it's a serious matter, calling for ramping up the sanctions. State sponsorship of terrorism, I think we've seen that, ever since 9/11. This has become a part of the vocabulary, and I don't think that sanctions against genuine terrorist groups, anyone would dispute that. But the problem is, of course, that there are organizations. The question is, who is classified as a terrorist, and that is the crux of the problem here, because there are many organizations that are legitimate. For example, political parties like Hamas and Hezbollah that are participants in democratic elections in their respective countries. And then finally, the question of regime change, that again, sanctions are a means of putting pressure on these countries, on these entities, in the hopes of achieving regime change, which has not been terribly successful. Why is the United States the leading sanctioner? Well, first of all, because it is today the sole superpower. And as you'll see, it takes a superpower, and it takes a country which has, or an entity that has a very large economy, to effectively sanction. The U.S. has also taken on the role for many decades of the global enforcer, or the world's policeman. And so it's in that vein that the U.S. sees, its role as being the leading sanctioner. Then there's the question of the extraterritorial application of U.S. law. So in most countries, when law that's passed by the legislature of a country, those laws apply to anything that happens within the borders of that country, or to anything that that is based in that country. So to some extent to that country's citizens, to some extent to the corporations that are headquartered in that country. But the application of US law by the federal government is taken to have a much wider implications, in the sense that it can involve two parties that are neither of whom are US entities. So you can have two parties who are engaged in a US dollar transaction. It could be like between a buyer and a seller, between a German buyer and an Iranian seller, for example. And the United States Justice Department says, okay, we have authority on US dollar transactions, and so we are going to block that transaction between a German and an Iranian. And it does so by threatening the banking channels that exist. So the transaction has to go through a series of banks, and many of those banks have, most of those banks have some kind of US operations or some kind of linkage to or other transactions with US entities. And so the US can apply sanctions on those banks, or can tell the entities that are US entities that, okay, do not do business with that bank. So it's a loss to those banks. And so it's a sort of a long chain of control through who has economic connections with who else. Taxation. The United States is the only country in the world that taxes the worldwide income of individuals. Paradoxically, that does not apply to corporations. So it's only when a US corporation brings profits back to the United States that those profits are taxed. So it's a very inconsistent policy, although it's consistent from the standpoint of capitalism, because it's favoring the corporations over individuals very explicitly. US content. So the US Justice Department has exercised its power to sanction something because it contains or blockade something because it has US content. It doesn't have to be manufactured in the US. It could be something that simply has a US patent, and that patent was licensed to a Korean firm, and it's in the product, and the US can block it. Okay, again, by telling the corporations that are doing the licensing or that are manufacturing it that you know, if they allow this to be sold to North Korea, then you know, they will get a hit. And then through just sheer political power at the major bodies of the world, United Nations, World Bank, IMF, NATO, OECD. And as I mentioned, its significance as the world's largest economy. So why is the size of the economy so important? Well, look at it this way. When sanctions are applied, there's an economic loss. There's the sanction, the impact of those sanctions is to cut out some trade or some investment or some economic activity that affects both the US and the targeted country. So in other words, US corporations will lose business in that country. So for example, if we take Cuba as an example, there's economic activity that does not take place because of the embargo. And what that means is that it's a loss to the Cuban economy. It's also a loss to the US economy. But when you look at it in terms of what fraction of the economy does it affect? So in the case of Cuba, its total GDP is 97 billion. And this is against the US GDP. And I think this figure is from a year or two ago when I started this talk. It's probably about 23 trillion right now. Although this year it's going to go down because of the pandemic, but last year. So the impact on the Cuban economy is about half the Cuban economy is lost because of the US embargo on Cuba, whereas the impact on the US economy is tiny. It's maybe 50 billion per year out of a $23 trillion US economy. And similarly with other countries, although the other countries like Iran and DPRK, which is North Korea, have much less, would otherwise have much less economic relations with the US just because of their location. They would have much greater trade with the countries around them. For example, with Iran, its major trading partners are, in addition to the Middle East, are India and China. DPRK, 90% of its trade right now is with China, 10% with Russia. But the same principle applies, that when the US applies sanctions, it's going to have a much, much, much greater impact on the targeted countries than it has on the US. And so, a small country cannot apply sanctions because it would be ineffective, because it would be very damaging to their own economy. I want to attempt to make a clarification about the difference between boycotts, embargoes, and sanctions, because this question is often raised. Well, you're against sanctions, but what about BDS? So boycott, divestment, and sanctions is a form of activism that was used very effectively to facilitate the overthrow of apartheid in South Africa, and is currently being used in the campaign to pressure Israel against its apartheid policies against the Palestinians. Now, the difference between these, this kind of a boycott, is that it is a withdrawal from commercial or social relations with a country, organization, or person as a protest or punishment. And the boycotter, so for example, in this case, the BDS movement, has only the power to self-withdraw from that relationship. It does not have any power of enforcement. It doesn't have any power to levy fines. It doesn't have any power to legally block transactions. So it's purely persuading a large number of people to engage in an economic boycott. An embargo, by contrast, is an official ban on trade or other commercial activity. And the embargoer, such as the US government, has the power over others to enforce that ban, that embargo. Sanctions are wider. Their net is wider. Sanctions impose a threatened penalty for disobeying a law, rule, or edict, which can include embargoes. It can include other forms of activity. The sanctioner has the authority and the power to penalize. The US sanctions carry the extraterritorial power to penalize third parties that have a relationship with the sanctioned entity. Now, let's go through a few countries that have been the key targets of US sanctions. So Iran is one that has been most in the news, and it continues to be in the news today. President Trump has announced some ramping up of sanctions, even after the global pandemic had started, and Iran was one of the early countries to be very, very badly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. What I want to do in this graph, I know it's complicated, but I just want to draw your attention to the text that's in red, because the text that's in red is the U.S. embargo or sanctions actions taken by the U.S. government against Iran or Iranian entities. And so they started very shortly after the Islamic Revolution in 1979. You know, at that time, of course, there was a very sharp political reason, which was the siege of the U.S. embassy in Tehran. And but as you can see, there been a lot more sanctioning of Iran since about 2006 onwards. And you know, the rationale for some of this only much more recently has been because Iran began to ramp up its enrichment, nuclear or uranium enrichment activity. And the sanctions resulted in, there's real teeth in these sanctions. And as you can see in the red box in the lower right, the United States in 2015 fines BNP Paribas, which is the Banque Nationale de Paris, the French bank that owns Bank of the West. The U.S. fines BNP Paribas almost $9 billion for sanctions violations. This is the largest fine that has ever been made in world history. And it's interesting that if you look, well, we will come to it later, but if you look at some of the fines, you'll see that some of the largest fines ever, and this is not the only one, were for sanctions violations, not for financial mismanagement during the financial crisis of 2008, or other fraudulent, you know, issues of fraud, but for sanctions violations. The Iran. This is just a timeline of the original plan of the Iran nuclear deal, which is known formally as the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So I put this here only to say that the JCPOA, which was signed in 2015 between the nuclear powers and Iran, was designed as a temporary measure where Iran would agree to freezing its nuclear program, reducing the number of centrifuges, and over time, the JCPOA would end certain caps on Iran's nuclear activity, with the idea that future agreements would be reached to end the Iranian nuclear weapons program, although Iran claims it is not a weapons program, but the Iran nuclear program, you know, once and for all, and have a final long-term agreement. That was the idea. This just shows you that the nuclear deal has had various phases. Okay, so what happened? So let me say one thing here before I go on, and that has to do with how the some of these agreements and the news reporting on the Iran nuclear deal are reported or misreported in this country. And so if you remember when the JCPOA was being negotiated, we read about it or heard about it as a negotiation between the P5+1 and Iran. Now the P5+1 was the P5, the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, that is the United States, Russia, China, Britain, and France. And then there was this +1, and I always wondered, why is there a +1? Why is Germany included? And it turns out that if you actually read the JCPOA, it never mentions the P5+1. The JCPOA says the EU/E3 +3. And that's the key, because the E3 are Britain, France, and Germany. They were the initiators of the JCPOA. And then the +3 are the US, China, and Russia. They decided to join in after the E3 initiated. So this is how it's known, and the negotiators are known in the rest of the world, particularly in Europe. They're known as the E3 /EU, and so the European Union is also another party. So in a sense, it's a P5+2 because the EU is a separate political entity. But anyway, so what I'm pointing out is that in the US, this is reported as if the United States is one of the primary negotiators of the JCPOA, and the reality is it wasn't, at least not at the beginning. In 2018, Donald Trump pulls out of the JCPOA, out of the Iran nuclear deal, and reimposes sanctions. And so those US sanctions have been ramped up gradually, well, a lot at the beginning in 2018, and then a few more in 2019, and a few more this year. And it includes, the US sanctions include sanctions against the export of Iranian handmade carpets, the export of caviar, the export of pistachio nuts. So Iran is not just an oil exporter, it's a diversified economy. And the point is that, the sanctions are applied against non-strategic commodities and so it's clearly designed to punish the country, punish the regime, punish the people of Iran for supporting that leadership. The impact of sanctions is non-trivial, and so this is a timeline, 2005 to 2019, of economic growth rate in Iran. And you see that as soon as I want to draw your attention to the far right, where the reimposition of US sanctions has turned the Iranian economy around from a strong growth rate in the previous 2 years to a very strong contraction of the Iranian economy of as much as 10% last year. And the fact that Iran was hard hit with the COVID-19 pandemic, and on top of that, there have been new sanctions imposed, that the Iranian economy is going to see a much more severe contraction in 2020. The sanctions have resulted in an unprecedented increase in commodities, just inflation, in Iran, and so this affects common Iranians. And I mean, we have this graph about the price of petrol, and it may seem surprising to you because Iran is this major oil exporter, or traditionally has been a major oil exporter, but Iran may have a lot of oil to export, and then because of sanctions, it cannot actually sell that oil. So it actually has a surplus of oil, but it has limited refining capacity. And so it has to export the oil and then import petrol to supply its own internal needs. Venezuela is the same thing. Now, even after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the U.S. trade with Iran has not been zero. And it's only recently that it has come practically down to zero. So even previous sanctions have not eliminated U.S. exports to Iran. And it's only under Trump last year, towards the end of last year, and this year, that U.S. trade with Iran has been brought essentially to zero. So there never have been sanctions against Iran that have been this tight, this strangulating. And I think I will skip. So this is what all I wanted to say in this slide was to show how there's fallout from U.S. sanctions beyond the targeted country. So this is a case where Novatek is Russia's largest liquefied natural gas producer in the Siberian Arctic, and they rely on Chinese ice-breaking tankers to get the oil out to the world market. But those Chinese liquefied natural gas tankers have been blacklisted by U.S. sanctions for carrying Iranian liquefied natural gas. And so you see how it just cascades. The impact of U.S. sanctions, cascades across the world. Now, there are some ways that, as you know, when the United States pulled out of the JCPOA, the European power, the rest of the country, the remaining 5 countries, the 6 entities, including the European Union, said, we're going to stick with the JCPOA. We're going to stick with the Iran nuclear deal. And so what they did is they said that, okay, we're going to provide support so that to blunt the impact of U.S. sanctions on Iran. So first, let's understand how the United States, one of the ways that the U.S. imposes sanctions on Iran and enforces them. So if we have an example here of John and Tina, and John and Tina want to do a transaction, or one of them wants to sell to the other and the other has to pay, and they have to pay through the international banking system. And let's say that Tina is located in Iran and John is in Germany. And the way that those international transactions take place is through 2 channels, and the 2 channels are for security, they're for verification, and so before the money actually moves, there's a communication between John's bank and Tina's bank through an international bank information system called SWIFT. That's the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. It's based in Europe, and that communication takes place. There's a handshake between the 2 banks that says, okay, this amount of money is coming. And then and then John's bank actually wires that money to Tina's bank, and the money actually transfers. And then the two have to be consistent in order for everything to go through. So all these international transactions depend on SWIFT. So the Europeans said, and the US can intercept things in SWIFT because it has a say in the governance of SWIFT, and it can block any transactions that it doesn't like. So the Europeans said, okay, we will set up an alternative mechanism called INSTEX. And the problem here is that even though this entity has been set up, most corporations are reluctant to use it because they still fear that the US will penalize them for using INSTEX. So the result is that that most transactions between Western corporations and Iran have been effectively blocked. Now we come to North Korea. So North Korea begins its program of both missile development, what are perceived of as ballistic missiles, although these missiles are always dual use because they can be used and have. I mean, North Korea has actually successfully launched Earth orbiting satellites. But these missile technologies are dual use. They can be used for satellites. They can be used for carrying weapons. And but that program began in 1993, and has ramped up as it has developed its nuclear weapons, beginning in announcing the first, that it assembled the first nuclear weapon in 2003. So this is what the U.S. ostensibly and the United Nations is responding to in applying sanctions. I just show this because there's been some opening up because the Moon Jae-in, the president of South Korea, who came into office about 3 years ago, wants a thawing of relations between the North and the South, reestablishment of economic relations, and eventually reunification of the two Koreas. And he has tried to resume various economic projects that were stopped under the previous president of South Korea. And Mr. Trump's response to that was that they won't do that without our approval. In other words, the South Koreans will not do that without our approval. They do nothing without our approval. So that's the attitude from the White House, South Korea will not be allowed to do what the U.S. doesn't want it to do. This is a study by Siegfried Hecker and Robert Carlin, two United Nations weapons inspectors. They were with the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. And when they did something like 40 inspections of North Korean nuclear facilities over the years. And the point of this is that it's a timeline. It's a timeline from 1992 to 2017. And the bars that are above the line are considered positive, or they considered positive. And they're positive, they're peaceful. So when US diplomacy was towards reconciliation was towards offering an olive branch to North Korea, the North Koreans responded in kind. They responded with their own olive branch. They responded in the lower two lines. They responded by stopping or slowing plutonium production. They responded by reducing the rate of uranium enrichment. When U.S. policy turned around and became more belligerent in 2002 under Bush II, then the North Koreans responded by ramping up their plutonium production. And it took a little longer, but then they also increased their uranium production. And I might add that whether the U.S. makes peaceful or anti-peaceful measures is totally independent of the political party of the U.S. president. So we have Clinton and Bush making peaceful moves, and then Bush and Obama making belligerent moves. So this is independent of whether they are Democrats or Republicans. And the same thing with nuclear weapons development and ballistic missile development is that the North Koreans respond in a way, in other words, if we want them to behave more peacefully, we need to offer olive branches to them and ramp down our rhetoric and our sanctions. That's the way things work. At least that's the way they have in the past, and there's every reason to believe that would work in the future. So more sanctions only make it worse, they don't make it better. Russia. Now Russia, even though the Russia, or formerly the Soviet Union, we had a Cold War relationship with the Soviet Union. The United States never had imposed sanctions on Soviet Russia, at least not classified in the way that they are now. And the only sanctions that have been imposed against Russia began in 2014 in response to the situation in Ukraine. And this is, after the Russians took control of the Crimean Peninsula, and that's when the sanctions began. So basically, what we're seeing here is that the blue lines are the U.S. and the EU sanctions, and that's when that really began. This is just to indicate that in relation to U.S. sanctions on Russia and also Ukrainian entities, and that's why these are listed officially in the OFAC website. OFAC is the Office of Foreign Assets Control in the U.S. Treasury Department, and they list these sanctions as Russia/Ukraine related sanctions because there are certain Ukrainian entities that are allied with Russia that are under sanctions. And as you can see, the types of sanctions, I don't want to go through the details here. I just want to draw your attention to the headings at the top. So tier 1, diplomatic sanctions. So that means sanctioning individuals, diplomats, and then individuals, and then the economic sanctions, which are against economic activity and corporations that engage in transactions with those Ukrainian entities or Russia. And then sanctions applied specifically to Crimea, and then the last column is Russian counter sanctions. So Russia actually attempted to counter sanction the United States, and of course we don't hear about them because they have very little effect. Russia is a small economy compared to the US, and so they really have very little power in that regard. This is just, again, one of these extensions of sanctions and how it affects. It has a much wider economic impact, and the U.S. policy has been to try to support Ukraine as a Russian adversary by promoting natural gas pipelines from Russia through Ukraine, because then Ukraine gets energy security. It also gets revenue from the passage of natural gas through its territory. And the Russians, on the other hand, have sought to build alternative pipelines such as South Stream through the Black Sea, and then Nord Stream 1, and now Nord Stream 2. And what the US has done is sanction Nord Stream 2, even though it has nothing to do directly with any sanctioned country. Well, I mean, Russia, of course, but it would hurt, probably more than anything else, it would hurt Germany because it's a direct pipeline from Russia to Germany. And of course it affects the companies that are involved in laying that pipeline. Just to give you some idea of the pipelines from Russia to Europe. Europe is very, very dependent on Russian energy, and these are all the pipelines that go through here. If you look up there in the Baltic Sea, you see the Nord Stream pipeline, and in the Black Sea there's the South Stream, and you see how these go around. These are bypass pipelines around Ukraine. The Russian response to sanctions has been to de-dollarize its economy, to shift away from dollar transactions and more towards transactions in euros or renminbi. The Russian central bank has slashed its US Treasury bond holdings from 96 billion to 8 billion as of October last year, likely more by this year. It has cut its US dollar reserves in half, and the National Wealth Fund has reduced its US dollar holdings by much more than half. So this is, the US sanctions are forcing other countries to de-dollarize. This is probably a good thing, because it means that we, in the long term, it will take a long time to get there, but that we will have a more pluralistic global economy in terms of currency dominance, and that would enable other countries to have more economic sovereignty if other currencies can play a balancing role vis-a-vis the dollar. Venezuela. So this graph is basically a timeline 2017 to early 2018, but it just shows that after Mr. Trump came into office, that he has been ramping up sanctions, and the targeting of individuals. What the graph shows is the targeting of Venezuelan individuals over this 15-month period, and so this is not something that has been going on ever since Hugo Chavez came to office in 1999. This these are sanctions that have been imposed exclusively by Mr. Trump and are something new. The result is that there has been economic collapse under Maduro. Maduro was elected in 2013 or 2012, but after he came into office, there has been an economic decline for a number of reasons, and partly it's because of the world capitalist market saying that we don't want to do business with Venezuela under a socialist government, and so there has been, the world capitalist system has been devaluing the Venezuelan bolivar, and there has been a gradual decline, a contraction of the Venezuelan economy before Donald Trump imposed the new sanctions. So that is true, but the sanctions have only made it worse, and they have caused this incredible inflation. You know, an inflation rate that is in the millions of percent. It's just unimaginable. But so it turned an economy that was already in trouble and turned it into absolute chaos. And so the sanctions have really hit very hard and taken a huge human toll in Venezuela. Cuba, the red circles are the U.S. embargo and sanctions actions, the major actions, and the most recent 2019 is when Mr. Trump reimposes travel restrictions and stops cruise ships and airlines from flying to any port other than Havana. So, you know, a real clampdown on travel and tourism to Cuba, and so that has hit Cuba hard. But what, in addition to that, has hit Cuba is the Venezuela sanctions, because the Venezuela sanctions mean that a lot of the economic transactions that Cuba used to have with Venezuela are no longer possible, because Venezuela can no longer afford to provide crude oil to Cuba, because its own economy is in collapse and its own oil production is in collapse. Let's skip that. So the situation with Cuba, of course, is that the United States is the lone embargoer. There's no other country, not even Canada or Mexico, support the United States on its embargo of Cuba. But it's very comprehensive in the sense that it's been there for a long time. A trade and investment embargo, a travel ban, which is still in effect, which restricts what U.S. residents can do in Cuba. To right now, it's really restrictive. It's limited to education and family visits and media, you know, press, and the restrictions on airline ship communications. So, for example, if I take my mobile phone and I have international roaming, I can go anywhere in the world and roam in those countries. But there are a couple of exceptions. One of them is Cuba. In Cuba, my phone cannot roam because there's no agreement between the U.S. carrier and the Cuban telecommunications companies. Same thing with North Korea. So these are really exceptions. Sanctions, of course, are being imposed. Sometimes they're not called sanctions, although recently in the OFAC website they started acknowledging that a lot of the actions, the embargo actions taken against Cuba are in fact sanctions. U.S. content ban. So there's anything that contains U.S. content. As I mentioned earlier, it can even be a patent. If something contains U.S. content, some kind of intellectual property, it can be banned for from being shipped into Cuba, and it will impose penalties on any company, any non-U.S. company for that matter, that attempts to sell that content to Cuba. U.S. dollar transactions. So credit cards, for example, I can take my credit card and I can use it in any country in the world except North Korea and Cuba. And so again, because there's no agreement between U.S. banks and Cuban banks, and those agreements are not allowed under the U.S. embargo. As I mentioned before, the world capitalist market devalues embargoed currencies. So every time there's a ramp up in sanctions, every time there's a new embargo measure, the world capitalist system devalues the currency of that country further. And this is the reason why Cuba had decided to have a dual currency system, and where you have the Cuban peso, which is its real currency. It's the currency that Cuban citizens use for the most part, versus the convertible peso, which is the currency that aligns with foreign currencies. And just to give you some idea, I mean, the reason that things, when we hear news about the earnings of Cuban citizens being, small, like $30 a month, it seems ridiculous. And it's ridiculous only because of the devaluation, the world capitalist system devaluing that currency so much that the value of that labor becomes so absurd. And it means that the purchasing power of the average Cuban is very limited when it comes to imported goods. And that devaluation is reflected in the ratio between the Cuban peso and the convertible peso, which is about 24-1. And so if we were to take those Cuban cost of living and multiply it by 24, we'd get a better idea of what it's really worth. As I mentioned, Venezuela sanctions have hit Cuba very hard. And nevertheless, the world response is, every year there's a vote in the United Nations General Assembly calling for an end to the U.S. embargo on Cuba. And the most recent one, held in November of last year, was 187 to end the U.S. embargo, and only 3 in favor. The 3 in favor were the United States, Israel, and Brazil under Bolsonaro. I want to mention this. Yes.
11:39. So
Okay.
maybe 5 minutes or so.
Sure. Yeah. I'll just mention here that Gaza is not under an explicit U.S. embargo, but it is under an Israeli embargo that the United States fully supports. And I'm in particular talking about Gaza, the Gaza Strip, which is under a full Israeli embargo. So nothing can get in or out except United Nations aid. And Gaza cannot sell its goods to the outside world because of the Israeli embargo on Gaza, and which again the United States fully backs. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are three major sanctioning entities: the United States, the United Nations, and the EU, of which the United States is the real driver behind all of them. And as you can see, the US, the number of countries covered by US sanctions is the largest versus the number that are under EU sanctions or United Nations sanctions, being more limited. So this is this is a list of the US sanctions programs. So on the left are the sanctions programs as of 3 years ago. And these are actual in the Office of Foreign Assets Control. These are the actual programs and the way they're divided. And most of them are countries, and some of them are for example, Magnitsky. Congress passed the Global Magnitsky Act, and the OFAC set up a program to enforce the Magnitsky Act against Russia, which was the original reason for the Magnitsky Act, and then to enforce it globally under a separate program. And anyway, you can see that there are a lot of targets of US sanctions. You can see that Syria, there's targeted Syria as a country, and then Syria related, which means other organizations, other entities that are not necessarily Syrian entities, but that are entities that support either ISIS or the Syrian government. Again, this is the a list of sanctions fines, and you can see that there are many very, very large, fines that have been imposed for sanctions violations that are on the order of $1 billion. I want to just mention a little bit about COVID-19 in the sanctioned countries. And I don't have a lot of data other than what we all have available. And the data are not necessarily very revealing because of underreporting. But these are the sanctioned countries under OFAC programs. And you see that the number of cases per unit population varies quite a bit, and the most hard-hit countries are Russia, Iran, Belarus, and Serbia. And now none of these figures are very high. The U.S. figure of cases per 100,000 population is actually much higher. The U.S. is about 400. And so these are not high, but there's also a lot of underreporting that's to be expected. The one country that we expect there is essentially no underreporting is Cuba, because it has a very comprehensive and reliable healthcare system, where they are very, very diligent at trying to track cases and do the testing. And but I would just say that some of the sanctioned countries, Russia, Iran, Belarus, and Serbia, are hard hit by the COVID-19 crisis, and to continue sanctions, which limits their ability to import needed medical equipment and supplies, PPE, is just a travesty, against humanity, to have these restrictions in a time of pandemic. If we look at death rates as a fraction of cases, again, there's nothing reliable here because there's just tremendous underreporting in many countries. I mean, Nicaragua looks like an outlier there, but it's just because there's tremendous underreporting of the number of cases. So there's nothing really meaningful that we can draw from this data. Why is the US dollar so important? So this is my last topic, and I'll try to go through it quickly. So the U.S. dollar, and the reason that when the U.S. Justice Department imposes restrictions on use of the U.S. dollar or U.S. dollar transactions, why is that so important? You know, because other countries could transact in euros, or they could transact in some other currency, but they don't, because this is the global financial system that uses U.S. dollars, and still the U.S. dollar is still the world's largest, by far the world's largest reserve currency. Almost 2/3 of global reserves are in U.S. dollars, and you know, this is by central banks around the world. It's been declining. It's been declining gradually over time, and we can expect that as a percentage of total global reserves, the U.S. dollar will continue to decline very gradually. In terms of the share of in foreign currency transactions, so foreign currency or currencies represent the world's most highly traded commodity. Okay, so $5 trillion of currencies are traded every day, at least before the pandemic. Now it's way down, but in normal times, like last year, currency is traded at the rate of 5 trillion per day. And of those transactions, 88% involve the US dollar. So that is how important the US dollar was in foreign currency markets. Why is that? Well, I mean, you know, when something is highly traded and highly stable, because it's the world's reference currency, so by definition, it has the ultimate instability. It imposes less risk on currency traders to trade in dollars. And so what this is an exchange rate table in Dubai, which indicates the spread. The spread is the difference between the buy and the sell rate. And basically, that spread is the commission taken by the trader, by the currency exchange, on the sell plus the buy side. And you can see that the spread is way down for the US dollar. It's only 1.23% for the dollar versus almost 6% for the euro, and higher for other currencies. So it's much cheaper to trade US dollars just because of its dominance in currency markets and its stability. And that's a huge incentive to trading in dollars. I won't go through this. So this is just the sort of the levels of sanction enforcement on US dollar transactions applied. You know, if we go from left to right on trade, assets, financial transactions, and investment, and then going from top to bottom, you know, it sort of ramps up in its comprehensiveness from impacting U.S. trade, the U.S. content, and then to all trade, or to, you know, going from U.S. to companies that have a U.S. footprint, to a total global ban. There are various ways that of course, usually smaller traders can get around sanctions because they're sort of under the radar. And I'll just show you a few of these. So this is in Iraq, near the Iranian border, where I was recently. And along the highway were all these idle tanker trucks. So these are trucks for carrying petroleum, crude oil and petroleum. And the period between 2015 and 2018, So 2015 to 2018 was when the JCPOA was fully in effect. Sanctions were lifted, and Iran could sell its oil without restriction. And so in this time, there was no need for these tankers because Iran was shipping oil directly out through the Persian Arabian Gulf. But before that, when there were sanctions before 2015 and after 2018 and after, this is sort of the safety valve. This is how small traders get oil out of Iran, take it into Iraq, take it to Afghanistan, take it into Central Asia, and then sell it from there. But there were just hundreds of these tankers along the route, and this is an oil storage depot in Iraq near the Iranian border. And then this is just trading. So these are tows. These are traditional ships that fly across the Arabian Gulf between Iran and the Emirates and the other Gulf kingdoms. And what you see here is you see a lot of you see ship-to-ship transfers. You see ship-to-truck transfers. And once again, this is a way that small traders can move goods in and out of Iran under sanctions. And finally, I just put this in here as North Korea. I mean, North Korea and Cuba are two countries that have weathered the COVID-19 crisis and sanctions remarkably well because they have systems. They have systems in place to handle these things. They have seen calamity before. They are prepared, and I mean, not without difficulties, of course, but they have, because they have been self-reliant, they have been able to survive these crises, and we expect that they will survive. They will pull through it. So that's what I have on sanctions, and I would be very happy. Thank you, and I'd be very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Sharat. And so, Jean, are you going to make your statement right now on?
Yeah. Let me just. We're going to go to questions in a few minutes. I'm unmuted, right?
Yeah, you're on.
Yeah, we're going to go to questions in a few minutes, but take a little break to announce future programs and tell you about our exciting new fund appeal program, so where you can actually give us money. So next week, we have a good program. Laura Wells of the Green Party is going to speak on public banking gathers momentum in 2020. I think most of you know Laura. She was the Green Party gubernatorial candidate in 2010, and a major part of her platform was public banking. And so she'll be talking about the promise of public banking, and including a discussion of the only state bank in the United States, or public bank, North Dakota. And then moving on, the following week, Sunday, May 31st, our very own Richard Fallenbaum will be discussing revolutionary organizations in the United States. Again, talking about programs that are trying to follow Lenin's principle for a revolutionary party of a new type, the communist parties. So those are coming up. And Richard, our treasurer, is not here, but I do.
Why don't we wait for another week for that, so that we can?
Okay, well, what I want to do is just post it into our chat, so that go to chat. You'll have the address, the PayPal address, and the Richard's address, where you can pay either through PayPal or mail. So with that,
Okay.
I will stop and go back to you, Raj.
Okay, very good. Thanks. Thanks, Sharat, very much for that very informative talk. And so now we are in questions and comment period. And those who want to ask question, please raise your hand, either physically, so if your camera is on, I'll be able to see, or using your button in the participants list. And so I see the first hand raised is that of Roger Harris. Roger, please go ahead.
There's a question from John Walsh in the chat.
Yes, yes. I don't need help,
That's all.
so I will continue to look for people, but please go ahead, Roger.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Sharat. That was an excellent presentation. And I especially liked the way you explained how the mechanisms of the US financial system is global and how they enforce them. Just a quick thing on Venezuela. Hugo Chavez died in March of 2013. And then there was a snap election and Maduro became president in April of 2013. It's important because it shows where the economic change came. And while you showed on Venezuela the sanctions that came under Trump, that was a continuity of policy from the previous administration. That 2014, 2015, President Obama certified that Venezuela was what he called an extraordinary and immediate threat to US national security. And that certification has to be renewed every year. And Obama actually renewed it right before Trump took the presidency because he was worried that Trump might not have followed the policy. But of course, Trump not only followed the policy, but intensified it. A thing about language, the UN and many of the victims of sanctions call them not sanctions, but they call them unilateral coercive measures. And I'm sure you've heard that term. And the reason for that is because, one, they're illegal, and we should always emphasize that they're illegal, that only the UN can impose these things. They're illegal under international law, and they're even illegal under US law, as well as the law of the Organization of American States. But that, so it's useful, at least the countries that are victims like to call them unilateral coercive measures. And then another language thing is the difference between embargo and a blockade. An embargo, I think you explained quite well, I should go back to sanctions. The reason why they don't like the word sanctions is that it infers that a country is being punished for a wrong deed, whereas these countries are really being punished for existing. So the notion that they're doing something wrong, other than breathing, is something that should be addressed. And finally, the difference between the embargo and a blockade, that in many cases, it's not simply an embargo, but it's a blockade because they involve third parties rather than just the United States saying, we're not going to trade with you and we're not going to buy from you. So, so those are sort of some comments, and perhaps you might want to.
Thank you. I'm going to limit people's, I didn't do it, but please keep it brief because we only have about half an hour. So Sharat, you want to respond to it?
Yeah, so just briefly, thank you, Roger, for that. That's very helpful. I just wanted to mention that yeah, I mean, you're right that, I mean, even though Mr. Trump is the one who really ramped up sanctions against Venezuela beginning in 2017, there were some sanctions before that. So it's definitely a continuity of policy. It's just much more exaggerated, you know, under Mr. Trump. But you know, the U.S. has always, in some way or another, been trying to restrict the Venezuelan economy. But yeah, but thank you for your other comments.
John Walsh is next. John, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks very much. I enjoyed the talk a great deal. I had actually have two simple questions. First of all, and they're related. I wonder whether, given the size of the Chinese economy, by PPP standards, the largest in the world, 130% of the US's, how is it that the renminbi is held back from being a bigger fraction of the basket of reserve currencies that are used in international transactions? And a related question, when you gave the gap between seller and buyer for currency traders on the international market, I don't think you mentioned I don't think on that list was China. What is the gap there? Do you know?
So this is regarding the Chinese renminbi. So the currency exchange rate or the spread for the renminbi is it would be larger because it's not it has not gained widespread acceptance as a foreign as a means of exchange, right? So even if a Chinese tourist wants to travel abroad, they're probably not going to carry renminbi. If they carry cash, they're going to get some dollars or some euros, and then carry that cash abroad. So it's not widely accepted. So the point is that if I go to currency exchanges around the world, if I go to the Middle East, I will see more acceptance of the Indian rupee than I will see of the Chinese renminbi. And so it's a process of acceptance, and it's a vicious cycle in the sense that the more something is accepted, and then the more people who use it, the larger percentage of all transactions that it becomes, then it becomes cheaper to trade in that currency, and so this is a sort of a positive feedback loop that can build up over time. The reason, other currencies, even the euro have. At one time, we thought that the euro would become the equal of the dollar because the eurozone was equal in size roughly to the U.S. GDP, and then that fell apart. Partly because of Brexit, but even before Brexit, it was falling apart because the world was saying that, well, it's not as much a reserve currency. There's no when people have money, where do they put it? They put invariably. I'm not just talking about people. I'm talking about central banks and sovereign wealth funds. Is that they put a lot of those assets into U.S. dollars because the U.S. has the world's deepest markets. If they want to buy debt, they'll go into treasury bonds because the treasury bond market is many times larger than any other debt market in the world, and it's stable. It's stable just because it's the U.S. dollar is regarded as the world's reference currency. So while other currencies fluctuate around, the U.S. is sort of the baseline. The U.S. dollar is the baseline, and everything is reference to the U.S. dollar. And other currencies, many currencies are pegged to it, either unofficially or officially, such as the Saudi Riyal.
Okay, Sharon?
Thank you. I was going to actually ask say a couple of things and ask a question along the lines of what you were just talking about. So I was interested in your statement that Russia's response to sanctions is to de-dollarize their economy, which I think is, the obvious right thing to do for a country that wants to stand up against the sanctions. And so I'm wondering why I have wondered why China hasn't stood up against the sanctions more. And in particular, they own a large amount of U.S. Treasury bonds, of U.S. debt. And with that comes a certain amount of power, because if they were to not to dump some of that, it would really affect the U.S. economy. And Trump is so stupid that he actually recently said that he threatened that the U.S. would actually pull that debt. But that's not theirs to pull. If one of his advisors immediately said, no, we're not going to do that. I forget the guy who said it, but one of his close economic advisors. But China has power because they do that. And a Chinese comrade recently told me that that they need another 5 years before they can feel comfortable not owning so much, or maybe not owning any U.S. debt. So I don't understand what that means in terms of, I guess, build up their economy enough and trade with other countries enough to be able to not be so dependent on U.S. Assets that are in U.S. dollars. And I'm hoping that will happen. The other thing I wanted to just, I think.
2 minutes.
Okay, sorry, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you for keeping that time. Thank you for doing that. Sharat, please go ahead.
Okay, so I'll just say that China actually has, reduced its dollar holdings as a percentage of its total holdings slightly, and the reason it feels that it cannot do more is because it doesn't remember that China has a stake in the global economy as the world's largest exporter. They have a stake in global economic stability. And so if they were to suddenly dump $1 trillion worth of U.S. Treasury bonds, that would be really rocking the boat. And so for that reason, they're going to proceed more gradually and more cautiously. And the other reason, as I said, is because of the depth of the debt markets. If you sold those U.S. Treasuries, where would you put that money? So that becomes a dilemma. And of course, they don't want to put it into a large amount of it into markets that are very risky.
Okay, so let's see. There is a hand here, sorry. Norma, please go ahead. You're next. It's your turn, Norma.
Unmute yourself.
It's muted again. Okay.
Now we can hear you.
Yeah. I think Sharon might actually agree with me. Trump is not stupid. Trump is the president of the United States, and Trump is destroying Earth, as we know. And Trump and his agglomeration of advisors and all are doing it. They're keeping in line with this whole motive of, somehow they have this idea of doing it. It kind of reads like Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. They just keep on doing it as though they're not going to be destroyed by the destruction of Earth. So it's not that he's stupid, he's horrid, he's ugly, he's mean. He's on one line to do what he's been doing for how many decades now. I never saw his program. It's unbelievable to me that he had the program and that he got the recognition that he did while he did and after when he became president. So stupid, he does all the wrong things for sure. And they are keeping him in power, and unfortunately, he's going to win the presidency, to get reelected. Anyway.
Okay, Sharat, do you want to respond, or you want the next question?
No, we can have the next question, but thanks for the comment.
I see a hand there, Judy Ans, but let me do mine, if I may. Judy, is that okay? All right. So few comments and then some you can respond to them because they're kind of question comment mixture. First of all, I think describing EU as countries as allies of US isn't really accurate in my opinion. Sorry, I have to dismiss it. Yeah, it's not really accurate in a Marxist sense because they are really dependent countries. They're not allowed to have an independent foreign policy by the United States. They're under US control and they dare not step out of it. And when they do slightly, they are slapped back into position. So term allies probably doesn't apply, and this is the relationship United States has with every country, even its allies. It has to dominate them. So that's the nature of imperialism. You can comment on that, but I have a few others. The boycott of South Africa is not there are two reasons given. One is Cuban forces defeating South African forces in Angola, and the other is this boycott. So I want your opinion. Some people say it is one, the other people say it's the other. And which one is the primary, secondary? I like your opinion on that. In your curves there, the Iranian oil production you showed, or maybe I misunderstood, in 2020 to be going down to zero, but I don't think they're zero. Maybe the export are very reduced. So that's just a comment. The other thing I think maybe was not intended, you said Cuba supported USSR's invasion of Afghanistan. Is the term invasion of Afghanistan correct? And they were
2 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. And then on China, just if you allow me a few more seconds, China really has a capitalist relationship with the United States. It's not like the Russian relationship, a USSR relationship with the United States, which was contention. Chinese relationship is a partnership of commodities, cheap produced in China, using American and European capital, and then selling it. Why would it behave differently, even if it's run by a Communist Party? Please address those if you care to. Thank you.
Okay, so let's start with the last one because I can remember it, which is China is it's a mixed economy, and the dynamics of its market economy are those of capitalism, with a very large state-owned sector. And so the dynamics of it are that, and so in that sense, it's totally compatible with the global capitalist system, and that's how it's prospering, and that's why its policies are consistent with the global capitalist system. But it has contention with the superpower hegemony, with the non-economic aspect of U.S. policy. Now you're going to have to remind me of just give me keywords of the other questions because I can't remember all of them.
I think those are like Cuba supported USSR's invasion. I don't consider that as invasion. They were asked by the government in Afghanistan to help them, and so I wonder if you really meant to say.
No, I didn't say anything like that. I didn't say anything about Cuba in relation to an invasion of Afghanistan.
I saw that, but in your slide. But
in the slide.
Yeah, in the slide. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's not important if you don't consider that.
Yeah.
And the boycott of South African, the boycott of South African commodities versus Cuban thing. What's your opinion? Which one is the primary reason for the defeat of apartheid? if you have any, if you
Well,
care.
I think it's actually neither. I think actually what defeated apartheid is the internal contradictions of apartheid and the fact that you have, you know, a population that's it's a white minority government, and even within the white minority there was this conflict between the Boers and the Anglos, and remember that apartheid started not when the first settlers came. It came in 1950 when the Boer government came in and said, you know, we have to have this separation, and so I would think that the BDS, you know, accelerated the demise of the apartheid government. I don't even think the Cuban involvement in Angola and Mozambique was because after all those were Portuguese colonies. So you know, how much impact does that really have on South Africa?
But the South African forces were involved in that.
Yeah, but I think that's secondary. I think
That's fine.
yeah.
I think we should go to the next person, Judy Ann.
Okay, thank you. I thought those were good questions though, Raj. I remember being completely bowled over and said, how in the world is this possible? When I saw that the Central Bank of Venezuela had money in Citibank and that Trump had gotten Citibank to take that money and put it into the Federal Reserve. And so, Sharat, it seems to fall under the total illegality of sanctions. They are essentially doing what they want to do with the overriding threat of the economy and the role of the dollar in the world and the military and the role that the United States has in terrorizing the rest of the world. But just, I think he knows, or his advisors know, they're doing exactly what they want to do. And they wanted to take that money. So now Venezuela doesn't have that money either to take out of their account at Citibank. And Citibank goes along with that. It's now in our Federal Reserve. So thank you for having this discussion. It doesn't surprise me, like it shocked me when I first read it.
Sharat, your response?
Yeah, so I mean, the banks will or the corporations will do what they're told, not because they want to, but because there will be penalties if they do not. And you know, these specific actions, of course, they may not be laws, specific laws, or their you know, laws provide a framework, but not the specific authority to do these things. But you know, corporations will have to go along, otherwise they will risk getting fined and penalized in various ways. But sure, I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, I cringe at every time I hear something like, I mean, and that too, a lot of the U.S. government actions are based upon what I would regard as incorrect assumptions. In other words, if you say that that you know that some of these assets are the assets of a sovereign government, but then if your definition of the sovereign government is not the government that was elected in Caracas, but rather an exile government led by Juan Guaido, who was never elected as president, then your whole definition of who owns the assets, who is the rightful owner of those assets, is wrong. So, I mean, it's outrageous, but And we hear about these things every day, unfortunately.
So next is Jane. Jane, please go ahead.
Okay,
No, unmute yourself. Yeah, there you go.
okay, I'm unmuted. Okay, well, thank you very much, Sharat. You're really spoiling us here because we've learned to expect such good presentations that we really benefit from it. But I want to just say a couple of things. First of all, I think it's, we have a petition out that says sanctions kill. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind. And sanctions are an act of war, basically. Don't forget that World War II, our war with Japan, was started by the United States through a boycott, sanctions, boycotting all oil going to Japan. And basically Japan had actually no choice but to strike back. So I think we need to know the connections between sanctions, boycotts, and war. They're both aggressive acts of our imperialist state, I think. And I don't know how many people have died from sanctions. I remember that question was asked of Madeleine Albright. Was it worth, 500,000 people, children, dying of that? And she said, yeah, I think so. She later took that back, of course. So I just wanted to stress, sanctions still, they're an act of war, and they're part of this whole imperialist scheme that the United States is taking charge of. Well, thank you. Thanks, David.
So I don't see any hand unless I'm missing somebody, that's possible. I want to go back to Gary to make sure that he doesn't have a question. Is Gary there? And also, anybody else who has not raised his hands or not asked a question, am I missing somebody? Please raise your hand. Okay, Norma, before I go to Norma, I just want to make sure there's nobody else who has not spoken yet and wants to ask a question or make a comment. Nobody, okay. Please hold on. Norma, I'm going to unmute you and lower your hand. Go ahead, please.
Just a comment about us getting together. I, for one, really value these gatherings, especially in these times, and would like us all, as much as possible, to show our faces and to sit there and nod our heads and, be part of the conversation if you care to. That would be a good thing to do. Show your face on the screen.
Some people probably don't want to show their
No,
face.
I know what, I understand. I'm not saying they must. I'm inviting for a reason.
If I hadn't shaved, I wouldn't have done it. Okay, who is next? Judy, you have a comment?
No, I was thinking that there was somebody coming in and asking questions about a cryptocurrency, which I have no understanding of. I've only heard Norma talk about it. And the question was, Sharat, where you think this can possibly fit in?
So there has been actually a lot of talk about cryptocurrency as an alternative channel for international transactions, and it's plausible, except that the stability of cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin is still leaves something to be desired, just because it's not universally accepted. The banks have played with it a little bit, but they're just afraid of the risk because it it's one of these things that is not heavily traded enough, and the market in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies is not deep enough to ensure stability, and so one day it could double in value, and the next day it can come right back down to a third of that. So it's just not stable enough for any kind of serious traders to use it as a medium of financial exchange.
Okay, Sharon, you're next.
Thank you. I wanted to build on what Jean mentioned. And Jean, you mentioned that there's a petition about ending sanctions. I think that's been put out by the Veterans for Peace. And I think that we ought to be talking about what can we get, how can we push the struggle against sanctions during this period and in the upcoming election. I think that petitions are really good, just educating people about what it all means and how it boils down to the death of children all over the world. I'm just wondering if other people have ideas about actions that, you know, that actually what things that we can actually do in the next period.
Well, I just want to, oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say one thing before we go on, and that is that you know, this moment in a way is an opportune moment. You know, the COVID-19 pandemic, because I mean there are a lot of people, including the UN Secretary General, who have said that, you know, that sanctions, all sanctions ought to be suspended in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, this is a humanitarian necessity. You know, the whole of humanity we have a common struggle against COVID-19, and to the extent that sanctions inhibit certain countries from combating COVID-19, it's absolutely an anti-humanitarian act to have sanctions against those countries, because it has real impact. I mean, even though the U.S. sanctions have, you know, on paper, have these exemptions for medicines and medical devices and PPE and so forth, in practice, shipments, for example, from China, have been blocked from going to Cuba, Venezuela, and other countries that are under sanctions, and because the shippers were blocked. They said, well, you can't ship, and so it's you know, this is an opportune moment to say, look, for humanitarian reasons, we need to lift all sanctions.
Okay, we have 2 minutes remaining. There are 2 people. One is Roger, and then Jean. Unless somebody else who has not spoken wants to speak, I will give them the first chance. So please raise your hand. Otherwise, I go to Roger next. Roger, go ahead. And if somebody has not spoken, can speak, can raise their hands. Otherwise, I'll go to Jean after that.
Just really quickly, on the cryptocurrency, Venezuela did try to create a cryptocurrency called the Petro. It was backed by the huge oil reserves and also gold reserves of the country. When the Venezuelans launched the cryptocurrency, the US government sanctioned them for that. And the crime was that the Venezuelans were trying to get away from being sanctioned. So they were sanctioned for trying not to be sanctioned. And that was, gives you an idea of just the power of imperialism and why we have to smash it.
Jean, you want to comment? Sorry, Sharat, did you want to respond, or shall we just go to Jean?
No, I mean the confidence in a cryptocurrency, you know, it also depends on parties outside of Venezuela having confidence in it. So that's the crux of it. I mean, if it were for internal transactions within Venezuela, it might be sustainable. But you know, when it's a problem of Venezuela trading with the outside world, then it you know, others would not have the confidence, precisely because it could be sanctioned.
Okay, thank you. Jean, you're next.
On Bitcoins and cryptocurrency, we did have a very nice talk by a fellow named Josh, who's a trader. That's his job, is being a Bitcoin person. And it was a good talk. I don't think we recorded it, but he did make the point, first of all, about Bitcoin specifically. There are different kinds of cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin specifically are not controlled by any government. But they are kind of a, I guess computer geeks know about this, but I don't. But you know, you can trade in those, so forth, and it's not controlled by any government. And so that means the governments are going to try to control it. And they do. I believe when I filled out my income tax, I had a place. Did you make any money from Bitcoins? Or how much Bitcoins did you have as income? So yeah, the governments are starting to control it. Facebook tried to get the Libra going, but they wouldn't approve that. But China is looking into to cryptocurrencies too. So that's an important topic. I don't know anything about it, and we need to have another talk on it. So.
Okay. Thank
Raj,
you.
David
I
Paul
have-
is trying to speak, but
I have, I have David Paul next. I'm going to unmute him. And David, please go ahead.
Yeah,
And Sharat, if you don't mind, I'll let him speak and then you can answer both.
okay, just quickly, in terms of, you'd mentioned the sanctions kill, there is a sanctions kill campaign. There's a website. It has many detailed ways people can participate in the international call for actions against sanctions on from the 25th to the 31st of this month, including lobbying, as much as that works or not, supporting Omar's bill about limiting Trump's hold on sanctions. There's many other kind of actions. So I encourage people to go to that website, Sanctions Kill. It's sponsored by not just Veterans for Peace, but many other groups. And there's many detailed ways people can take action during that week in conjunction with other people around the world, actually. So I just wanted to recommend that. There are some things people can do